The Apollo program, a monumental venture that would ultimately send humans to the moon, was one of the greatest achievements in human history. Yet, what many people don't realize is that this program, which symbolized mankind's highest aspirations, had an incredibly rocky and disastrous beginning. Today, we'll take a deep dive into the early days of the Apollo program, highlighting not just its triumphs, but also the failures, challenges, and setbacks that shaped its legacy. To understand the scope of the Apollo program's disastrous start, we need to go back to the early 1960s, when the United States was locked in a fierce space race with the Soviet Union. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy announced an ambitious goal, landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth before the decade was out. This marked the birth of the Apollo program. It was a bold mission, one that required technological advancements and problem-solving on an unprecedented scale. However, as history would show, achieving such an audacious goal was not going to be easy. NASA's experience with human spaceflight began with the Mercury and Gemini programs, which were stepping stones leading up to Apollo. While these programs were relatively successful in their own right, the leap to Apollo was enormous. The Apollo spacecraft was far more complex and required significantly more power than its predecessors, leading to numerous engineering and safety challenges. The disaster began on January 27, 1967, an infamous day in NASA's history. This was the day of the Apollo 1 mission, originally known as AS-204, which was intended to be a low Earth orbit test of the Apollo Command and Service Module. Astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger B. Chaffee were chosen for this critical mission. Each of these men had extensive backgrounds in aviation and space travel. Grissom was one of the original Mercury astronauts, Ed White was the first American to conduct a spacewalk, and Roger Chaffee was a talented rookie astronaut making his first flight. On that fateful day, the Apollo 1 crew was inside the command module, conducting what was supposed to be a routine plugs-out test. This meant that the spacecraft was disconnected from external power, running solely on its internal systems. The objective was to simulate launch conditions, testing how well the spacecraft's systems would operate in a real flight environment. However, a seemingly mundane event soon turned into an unimaginable catastrophe. As the astronauts were strapped into their seats, tensions were already high. Communications between the astronauts and ground control were spotty, with frequent issues and static interference. Frustration was building, but no one could have predicted the horror that was about to unfold. At 6:31 p.m., during the test, a fire suddenly erupted inside the sealed command module. The fire spread rapidly, fueled by the pure oxygen environment that had been chosen to simulate conditions in space. Within moments, the inside of the spacecraft became a deadly inferno. Tragically, the astronauts were unable to escape. The design of the spacecraft's hatch, which opened inward, made it impossible for them to get out in time. Despite the best efforts of the ground crew to rescue them, the fire consumed the spacecraft in less than a minute, killing all 3 astronauts. The cause of the fire was later attributed to a spark from damaged electrical wiring, but the real culprit was a combination of design flaws, poor safety protocols, and the volatile oxygen atmosphere. The death of Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee sent shockwaves through NASA, the US government, and the general public. This was the first time American astronauts had been killed during a space mission, and the disaster sparked outrage and intense scrutiny. In the wake of the Apollo 1 tragedy, the entire Apollo program came to a screeching halt. Investigations were launched to determine exactly what had gone wrong and whether the Apollo program itself was even salvageable. NASA, already under immense pressure to meet President Kennedy's ambitious timeline, now faced an existential crisis. The loss of life was a stark reminder that space exploration was not just a grand adventure. It was also a deadly serious business where even small mistakes could have catastrophic consequences. The public's faith in NASA was shaken, and some critics even called for the Apollo program to be abandoned entirely. But for NASA, giving up wasn't an option. Instead, the Apollo 1 disaster became a turning point. In response to the tragedy, NASA undertook a massive overhaul of its safety procedures and spacecraft design. The pure oxygen environment, which had been a major factor in the rapid spread of the fire, was abandoned for ground tests. and a safer nitrogen-oxygen mixture was introduced. The command module underwent extensive redesign, including improvements to the hatch, which was now made to open outward for quicker emergency escape. Every single component of the Apollo spacecraft was re-evaluated, and any potential hazards were meticulously addressed. But even as NASA worked to rebuild, the Apollo 1 disaster left deep scars. The astronauts who had lost their lives became symbols of the inherent risks of space exploration. Gus Grissom's widow, Betty Grissom, was a particularly vocal critic, demanding answers from NASA and ensuring that her husband's death would not be in vain. As the months passed, the investigation report revealed a sobering truth. The Apollo program had been moving too fast, cutting corners in the race to beat the Soviets to the moon. In a broader sense, the Apollo 1 disaster served as a grim reminder of the dangers of rushing technological progress without fully understanding the risks. The investigation into the fire concluded that NASA had been overly optimistic in its development timeline, leading to avoidable oversights. It wasn't just the Apollo spacecraft that needed fixing. The entire culture of the space program needed to change. Engineers, managers, and astronauts all recognized that safety had to take precedence over speed if they were ever going to achieve their lunar goal. The lessons learned from Apollo 1 reshaped NASA and the Apollo program in profound ways. After the disaster, NASA prioritized safety over expediency, and the focus shifted to making sure that every system and every component of the Apollo spacecraft was fully tested and understood. While it delayed the timeline for landing on the moon, this new approach laid the foundation for future success. In the years following Apollo 1, NASA successfully launched several unmanned Apollo missions to test the redesigned spacecraft. Each mission brought them one step closer to their ultimate goal. Apollo 7, the first manned mission following the disaster, launched in 1968 and was a resounding success. The crew, consisting of astronauts Wally Schirra, Don Isola, and Walter Cunningham, orbited the Earth for 11 days, testing the new spacecraft systems and proving that NASA had learned from its earlier mistakes. Then came Apollo 8, which took a giant leap forward by sending astronauts to orbit the moon for the first time in history. This mission restored the public's faith in NASA and re-energized the Apollo program. Finally, on July 20th, 1969, Apollo 11 fulfilled President Kennedy's promise, with Neil Armstrong becoming the first human to set foot on the moon, followed closely by Buzz Aldrin. The world watched in awe as they planted the American flag on the lunar surface, marking the culmination of years of hard work, sacrifice, and dedication. While Apollo 11 is rightfully remembered as one of the greatest achievements in human history, it's important to remember that it came on the heels of a terrible tragedy. Without the disaster of Apollo 1 and the painful lessons it taught NASA, the moon landing might never have happened. The loss of Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee was a terrible price to pay, but their sacrifice paved the way for one of the most remarkable moments in human history. The Apollo program's early disasters, particularly the tragedy of Apollo 1, are a testament to the resilience and determination of those involved. Space exploration has never been easy, and it will never be without risk. But the willingness to learn from failure and persevere in the face of adversity is what allowed NASA to ultimately triumph. The disaster that marked the beginning of the Apollo program didn't define its legacy. Instead, it served as the catalyst for the success that followed. As we look back on the history of the Apollo program, it's crucial to remember both the victories and the setbacks. The moon landing may be the defining moment, but the story of Apollo is also a story of human error, tragedy, and the relentless pursuit of progress. Today, we honor the bravery of the Apollo 1 astronauts, whose lives were lost in the service of exploration, and we celebrate the incredible journey that turned a disastrous beginning into one of humanity's greatest achievements.